Hello, I'm Tim Barnes, and this is the best of You Are the Genre.
First I got your voicemail, then I got you. We can meet in person or maybe on Zoom. So tell me what's your genre, tell me what do you do. I'd like to know the things that specifically make you.
That's right, you heard me correct. This is the best of You Are the Genre. I'm your host, Tim Barnes, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about television. I love TV, I've written for TV, and some of the best conversations in this show have been about TV. Which is interesting because the whole purpose of this show is to figure out how different creative people have become their own genres. And that can be a complicated thing to discover, kind of like flipping channels on a television. Now, in normal episodes of this show, I ask my guests 3 questions. The first one is, what was the first genre that called out to you as a child? What was the first official craft that you pursued? And how you feel about that first pursuit now? I do that because that process of questioning helped me focus on the things that I wanted to do creatively. And with those 3 questions in mind, it's interesting how often television, that thing that used to be a square box in your living room. I remember when I was a kid, we still had one of those wooden televisions, which seems like such an ancient concept. I can't imagine seeing a wooden flat screen TV. But this is often one of the first points of discovery of the things that people are interested in. And in my conversation with Mike Sachs, who was one of the first people that I interviewed for the show, I became fascinated by his early interest in The Twilight Zone. Mike Sachs is a well-known comedy writer and journalist, and yet somehow The Twilight Zone, which isn't inherently comedic, was the first thing that called out to him. What was the first genre that you were drawn to?
Well, it was 2 things. It was Twilight Zone horror, the horror that takes place next door, not necessarily in space or on a mountaintop in a mansion. I found that too distant. But what fascinated me about Twilight Zone was things that could happen next door or in a portal in your mom's swimming pool. You dive down, you enter into a different world. That fascinated me. And then it was comedy. So it was really the combination, I thought, if I could combine Twilight Zone type things with comedy, make it a little bit scary, a little bit off, I thought it would be interesting. And the first time I saw that done was with Chris Elliott.
Just going to pause it here because of one of those technical issues that I mentioned earlier. It's kind of difficult to understand what Mike is saying in the original audio, but the broad strokes are that he found some of Chris Elliott's characters on The Letterman Show to be unhinged and frightening, yet oddly satisfying. One such character is the guy under the seat, as Mike Sachs describes it, which sounds like a Stephen King novel. Here's a clip.
Chris.
Hey, Dave.
Hi. How are you?
Is this straight?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
great.
Straight. What are you doing?
Well, Dave, you're looking at my own little corner of heaven. I'm moving in.
Chris, this is a television studio. You can't possibly stay here.
What? Oh, I get it. A joke.
Yeah.
There was no purpose to that character beyond just someone who was insane. And that combination of frightening and comedy appealed to me. And I think every character that I've written, not for the interviews, but for the fictional stuff, has Chris Elliott in it and has a little bit of Twilight Zone. I mean, these are people who are off in their own world and doing things that others might not be, and for reasons that only they see. They're totally delusional. And there's something about that I find fascinating.
I read this piece that Chuck Palahniuk wrote on his newsletter, and it was the first time I even thought about, wait, why does a show like The Twilight Zone exist, or shows like it, these anthology shows? And it's because these studios had all these excess props and sets, and they just wanted a reason to, like, you know, not throw them away and put them to good use. So if you think about it, like, The Twilight Zone is a pretty cheap product. And that's the same case for a lot of late night shows as well. Comedy is very cheap, and coming up with these mind-bending stories about the person next door, like you were mentioning, is a cheap thing to produce. But within those limitations come all these magical things that people get obsessed with.
Well, completely. I think that's completely correct. And that's a very, very different show to have come out. And at that time, had a lot to do with the nuclear age post World War II. And it's almost a miracle that that show existed when it did. But I find a lot of similarities between the Twilight Zone premise or Alfred Hitchcock Presents type premise and comedy. It's reality just sort of bent a little bit and looking in crevices where others aren't and making connections where others aren't. So I see a lot of similarity between Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock, horror, and poetry also, making connections that others aren't making with comedy. But I think there is a direct connection. I think that's why there is a lot of overlap between those who love the Twilight Zone and those who love comedy.
So now that we know that these are the genres that you were drawn to, was it a major pursuit in your life from childhood to want to create one of these shows? Did you write horror stories or Twilight Zone type things? Were you submitting to humor magazines?
In high school, I would write the Twilight Zone type stories, and actually, Twilight Zone magazine existed, and
Oh my
I
goodness.
I would submit to that. And Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and these were just garbage stories. I mean, a huge influence for me was Stephen King, and at a very young age, and I tried to write those stories. Those are the first type of stories I tried to write. But it always was easier for me to write comedy. It always became sort of comedy. So I try to combine the two, make it comedy first and then a little bit frightening. And that really was what I was trying to do. But my biggest dream was to write for David Letterman. That was really my dream. And this was a little bit past the prime before they went to CBS. I mean, that was my dream, to sort of freeze time and write when it was at its height. In retrospect, I don't know if I would have been happy doing that every day. I know writers, and certainly you know about this, where you have to show up every day and write, and it may be better in theory. But I had no way of getting to that point. I didn't know how one became a writer for David Letterman. So I started writing pieces for Mad Magazine and Crack Magazine and submitting to Playboy, which never worked out, New Yorker at that time, which never worked out. But I thought by doing this, by putting it out myself, I would be discovered, like a minor league baseball player will be pulled up to the major leagues after they're discovered. And of course, that is not the way it works. But by doing that and forcing myself to do it, I taught myself to write for print, which I think, ironically, in the end is where I belong. I don't think I belong in television. It was always my dream to write for TV, and I have attempted to do it, but it just never worked out, which is fine with me because now I am in a medium which I enjoy doing the most.
It's funny. The Twilight Zone is going to pop up one more time maybe in this conversation, but I've always fantasized about writing for late night. When I finally got to writing for The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon during the pandemic, it felt like the Twilight Zone because everything was severed from tangible reality. The show was taking place at the host's house. I was in my apartment. You're writing jokes that aren't eliciting laughter. You come up with a game for the host to play with someone, and they're just on Zoom. And so it made me deconstruct what is even the joy of creating content without the live element of it.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me because that's why I wanted to do it. Because to me, being in a room full of like-minded people was a dream because that didn't really exist for me in high school. And being in a writer's room, whether it was in Your Show of Shows or The Simpsons or Late Night with David Letterman, that was the dream for me, to be around like-minded people, throwing around jokes, people who had the same sensibility. But what I found was that doesn't always exist. You know, the dream writing rooms were rare. And the thought now of being with other writers in a room 12 hours a day would be madness. But I can certainly see where that would be. You know, it's funny. Sometimes you achieve a dream and it's just a different time. You know, you came up during COVID. So that reality did not coalesce or didn't connect with the reality that you had as a kid dreaming about writing for late night, right? So it's a different reality. And sometimes when you see the reality of it, it seemed a lot better when you were a kid. And that certainly happened with me. I mean, I've written for certain magazines and done certain projects that I would have killed to have done as a kid. And then when you do it as an adult and you see the reality of it, That is not taught to you as a college writing student, because a lot of times professors aren't out there in the world hustling. They have their professorship.
Were there pitfalls along the way? Like, how did you make that leap?
Oh my God,
When you
pitfalls. I
entered
mean,
journalism, was that escaping from the path of comedy and Twilight Zone type
it
writing?
was in a sense, because I was in New Orleans and then DC, and this was just as the internet was coming up. And there was just nothing, I didn't have the balls to move to New York, Chicago, Toronto, or LA. So I was, sort of out in the woods. And the only way I could really make a living was either retail, which I did for 10 years, from 15 until I was 25 at a record store, or it was just to get a journalistic job. I never had any interest in journalism. I never took a journalism course in high school or college. Never wrote anything. But those were the jobs available when I moved back to DC. Plenty of those type of jobs there. And the comedy scene in DC at that time was nothing. It's improved a bit, but it was nothing at that time. So the only way really to make a living in writing was to work as an editor and to do dry type of writing for these various associations or news services, then eventually the Washington Post. But it was always my dream to then continue to try to make it as a comedy writer. And it was only when McSweeney's came out for me, it was 1999 that when I saw it, I thought, okay, this is the type of comedy that I would like to write. Because before that, I had been writing for Crack Magazine and Mad Magazine, and it was fun and it paid well, but it wasn't my type of comedy. So when I saw McSweeney's for the first time, I thought this is a good fit for me.
Moving along, television crept up in another compelling way during my conversation with comedian and actress Anna Suzuki. Anna is biracial and she grew up in Japan, and while in Japan, her father appeared on many Japanese television shows. But when she moved to New York, when she moved to the US, television played an important role in her discovering who she is as a Japanese American woman. And this was a conversation that probably broke the record for how often I laughed, but also how cathartic it ended up being by the end of it. So I'm interested in this because you moved to America to New York specifically.
To Manhattan, yeah.
Manhattan at age 14.
13.
13. Mm-hmm. So you already have established all of these pop cultural things that you love in Japan, and now you're absorbing all kinds of new stuff when you get to Manhattan. So maybe there's two genres, I don't know, but what is the first genre that called to you when you were a kid?
I know listeners can't see my face, but yes, there are two genres. Or I don't know, maybe I don't know if you're using this video, but
no videos. Video's too much work.
Okay, great. Yeah. Then I'll take off my top. So I was thinking, growing up in Japan, there were two genres that really influenced me, not looking back. And one is Ghibli movies. I don't know if you're familiar, but basically it's like the biggest Japanese animation studio. If you have any friends who are like obsessed with Japan, or like if you look into anything Japanese culture, you'll recognize these characters, but it's like My Neighbor Totoro and
Spirited Away. Is that
Spirited Away is the same? Yes. But the ones that I watched as a child were like late 80s, early 90s Ghiblis. So, but the same family. Yeah. Spirited Away. And those movies, there was no cynicism. Everything was really earnest. And the themes were always so universal. And then when I became a little bit older in Japan, I obviously watched a lot of variety shows and comedy shows. And it's so hard to describe. Like, I think this is only relatable if you maybe grew up in two countries, but the sense of humor in Japan is so indescribable to people in the West. Like, when you think of Japanese variety shows and game shows, I think most Americans think like, oh, look at those crazy Japanese people climbing up like a lubed, like a stair full of lube. Like, it's a lot of wacky slapstick. Sound effects,
flashing lights.
Like sumo wrestlers pushing you down. Just like a lot of wacky stuff like that. But growing up, watching that as a middle schooler, A lot of it was really smart, really self-aware, really satirical. I mean, of course, there's a lot of slapstick that I loved too. I'll send you this clip later, but or maybe we can post it as supplemental material,
Yeah, there we
like
go. Yeah.
serial. But there was a recent sketch where this sketch group, like this girl is introducing her new boyfriend to her family, and she takes him to meet her family. And then they get to the house, and the house is slanted.
Mhm.
So it's like it's really hard to, I mean, it's not hard to describe. You just have to watch it. But this guy's trying to meet his girlfriend's family, but the house is slanted.
I'm
so
already
they have
laughing. I like it already. I totally understand.
You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
so there's obviously basic slapstick stuff like that. But like one of my favorite shows ever growing up was these comedians. They would play this game where they would dress up like a bike gang, like tough guys. But then actually never mind. This is like so hard to describe on a podcast. But they would basically do like very academic wordplay, but dressed as bike gangs, and just a lot of juxtaposition and satirical stuff that was just so self-aware and so smart. And so that's the kind of comedy I grew up with. I feel like I just used the most difficult to describe show as an example. I'm going to try to come up with something
Got it.
that makes more sense verbally.
These were the two genres in Japan.
Yeah.
Did something change when you got to Manhattan?
In New York, I remember the first shows I watched were Friends and Seventh Heaven.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Did you ever watch Seventh Heaven?
I did watch Seventh Heaven.
You
I'm very
did?
embarrassed about the fact. Yeah, I did. It was a very cozy family.
You're right. It was really cozy. I also watched 90210, and I was like, I didn't realize all those actors were like 35.
Yeah, yeah, that's always what it is. And the locker's always bigger than they are when you actually
Yeah, so the shift was kind of jarring because in Japan, I felt like the content was very earnest and very cerebral, very subversive, very smart. And then a lot of the stuff that I was suddenly exposed to here in America was like, it felt very commercial and sort of lacking sincerity. And I mean, maybe I'm just saying this in hindsight. I don't think I thought this as a 13-year-old, but the heart was not there.
Yeah. Then again, you are comparing Japanese sketch comedy to Seventh Heaven. I think. I think that may be the disconnect.
Oh my God. That's the title of my autobiography. Japanese sketch comedy to Seventh Heaven.
Seventh Heaven.
Yeah.
I like the idea of you watching and be like, I get it. This is cerebral comedy, right? There's no way that this is an actual dramatic show.
Oh my God. Yeah, that is a jarring shift.
So what is it about the Studio Ghibli? I'm saying that right, Ghibli.
Yeah.
I was going to say Ghibli. And
maybe in English it is Ghibli. In Japanese it's Ghibli, but I don't know. Yeah, whatever.
Right. Yeah, we'll look it up. That'll be in the that'll be in the supplemental materials.
So okay.
Along with the court records. We haven't even gotten to the court record yet. But what is it about those characters, and is it because it is very open to like a child's imagination and that you kind of thought you could wander in those worlds?
Like one of my favorite movies is Kiki's Delivery Service, or in Japanese it was Majo no Takkyubin. But we'll put that in.
Sounds much more intriguing that
way. The theme is pretty simple. The story is about a 13-year-old girl who's a witch. And in this world, once a witch turns 13, she has to leave her hometown and go move to a new city and go find herself. It's basically like a small fish. What is it? Oh, like a coming of age story. Small fish in a
Big
big
pond, fish out of
pond,
water.
fish out of water.
Yeah, all the
Exactly.
fish. Yeah,
Yes,
just
exactly.
teach a fish to swim. Yeah,
Teach,
no, is that
yeah, teach a fish to swim. Yeah, exactly. Teach a witch to swim. Exactly. That's the basic story. But I love it because the theme is so universal. I was rewatching it yesterday actually, and I just found myself like crying so much. And I didn't realize it would hit me so hard as a woman in my 30s. But, it's so universal. We all go through this, like going to a new place, or not even physically, maybe even emotionally entering a new place, and it's scary and we don't know anyone. I think it's just so, I don't know. What do I like about it?
Well, I'm already seeing a connection here because you followed the same path as his character. You, at age 13, you moved
Oh
from
my
Japan.
Wait, Tim, I seriously didn't make that connection. Am I stupid?
I mean, that's a big deal. Like you love this.
I'm firing Joyce, my therapist, right now, and I'm hiring you. Sorry. Wow.
TV entered the chat yet again during my conversation with writer Mychal Denzel Smith, who's written multiple New York Times best-selling books, and in our conversation wound up talking about how television can be a great tool in the process of grieving and, in some ways, communing with the dearly departed.
But then, actually, in thinking about it, my mom passed recently, and when we were there, as she was doing in-home hospice, what we were doing is trying to make her as comfortable as possible, give her all the things that, like, to the extent that she can enjoy them, like, she wasn't really eating at that point. But, the TV was just on all of her favorite shows, everything that she would watch in her leisure time. And going through it, just realizing, like, oh, my mom really, that's where I get it from, is my mom, like, these, like, mysteries. And even, like, stuff that's, you recognize that, like, a procedural, all of your long-standing procedurals are just mysteries, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
you're just trying to figure out who did the thing, or, like, how do you find how do you find the killer? How do you find the robber? Like, all of this stuff. And she really loved when I was growing up, and in part, like, we watched a lot of this because when we lived in, my dad was in the Navy. When we lived in Italy, these were just shows that were available in English. We had one channel, I think, that was English. My mom carried it over from her childhood in some ways. Perry Mason. Perry Mason was an absolute favorite. Matlock, Murder, She Wrote.
Yep.
It's these hour-long, like, mysteries in which
they're all so good.
They're so good.
My grandpa, who recently passed away, that's my go-to memories are watching those shows with him.
They're so good because, in part, because of how neat they are, right? It's just, here's an hour. Here's this, like, really smart, great detective-like figure who is going to piece together all of the things that aren't quite right about this situation, right? Like, Perry Mason and Matlock are both defense attorneys, right? Like, they don't have to solve the crime itself.
Yeah, they're true American heroes. They're like, all
they have to do is defend their client, right? Like, they just have to provide reasonable doubt. That's it. They don't have to have bulletproof evidence that, like, this person did, but they go out in search of the absolute truth. Like, actually, no. And they get the person on the stand that actually did it, and they like grill them with all of the different pieces of evidence that they've put together. And it's Murder, She Wrote's funny because I revisited Murder, She Wrote recently because it's streaming on Peacock. And, like, if Jessica Fletcher shows up to your town, like, somebody's dying, I would just ban Jessica Fletcher from coming.
Yeah, Jessica Fletcher is the angel of death.
truly, because she's in like Maine or wherever it is that she lives, and there's a bunch of episodes set there, but a lot of it is her traveling and going to these other places, and it's just like as soon as she arrives, whatever conflict that has been brewing, somebody dies. And it's like, well, maybe if Jessica wasn't here, we could have had some conflict resolution or something. I don't know. But again, it's just this sense of something is wrong, something bad happens, and we just need to figure out how this happened, who's responsible, and we tie things up really neatly. And I love that. Like, I love a neat conclusion to things. And it offers something that just is a solve to my soul, in part because I think, like, the understanding is, like, actually out in the world, there isn't, right? Like, there is no neat resolution to anything because everything goes on past that moment, right? Like, you can think that you've resolved the one thing, and then it opens up all of these new possibilities. I don't know how it happened. I don't know why, but I have developed chess as a hobby. Not original, right? Like, not an original thing.
Not the Hove thing to do, you know?
But that's the thing in chess, where you think you solved one problem, but you have new weaknesses that you have to address. And, like, the thing keeps going on and on and on. There's no neat resolution to, like, just the one problem. New problems arise. And that's what life is, right? Like, you think you resolve just the one thing, and then there's new obstacles, new challenges to face. And it's like, no, in a mystery, things get wrapped up and we're done. That is resolution. And, like, there's just something soothing about that, to being like, yes, we fixed it. That's it.
Yeah. There's something wonderfully communal about a mystery on television in particular, too, because I can imagine who I'm sitting with. You learn so much. You learn who cares about, the bigger structure of it all, who cares about the personal dynamics. And I think that there is a particular Black cadence to, being in a communal space watching Perry Mason or Matlock or something like that. To
where you'd be like, oh no, he did it. Oh yeah.
And I haven't I haven't experimented with this yet, but I'm sure that if I were to watch, those shows right now, I can, a little ghost of my grandfather will appear and I can hear his voice. I wonder, have you had that while rewatching some of these shows?
Oh yeah, like especially like right after my mom passed, like I watched a lot of Perry Mason. It was just sort of that like calming thing, or like that going through that morning and just being like, here's the things that my mom loved. Listen to a lot of Luther Vandross and Earth, Wind and Fire as well, and like, but watching it and hearing my mom respond to the TV in my mind, right? Like when a character would do something, it's like, oh no, she didn't, to say that, like something like that, like is ever present. And that, like, you started talking about that communal experience and that particular Black cadence of like bonding through our reaction to the thing and building upon one another and like one-upping one another in our response, and like that is something that is really appealing, especially when you're talking about like these mysteries and then people develop their theories and it's like, no, I told you, didn't I tell you that was going on? Didn't I tell you?
I feel like what actually truly makes Matlock work, though, what makes it a brilliant show, is that the Andy Griffith Show, the old show, Black and White, takes place in a mythical, timeless America where racial issues somehow don't exist in this southern-seeming town.
Don't exist at all, because there's no Black people.
But suddenly in Matlock, you've got Andy Griffith, acknowledging race and all of the layers of it. And I think that was like refreshing, particularly to Black viewers, that now
Yeah.
like you get Andy Griffith again, but he's in a world in which,
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's something sort of appealing to the Matlock character being this deeply Southern fried gentleman, right? but like looking for justice, right? And there's something that's maybe like slightly problematic in that presentation where it's like redemptive for the Southern white gentleman, but there's something that like for Black viewers it's being like, yeah, there could be a good old boy that just like actually
hypothetically, yeah, he's kind of like the magical, the white magical Negro in a way.
Matlock is white magical Negro. This is great.
Finally, I couldn't release a TV-focused episode of the podcast without sharing a clip from my conversation with former TV critic and current TV writer Ashley Ray. Television played an incredibly important role in her discovery of who she is as a queer woman of color, and also inspired her interests in the many crafts that she's pursued since. Was there anything that directly influenced your interest in journalism and that type of thing? Was there like any like characters on television?
Yeah, I don't know. It's really weird because I think that was just what I saw as respectable, because honestly, I'd always loved comedy. Like I knew I loved comedy and television, and I just kind of always was like, that isn't serious. You can't actually do that as a Black girl and like have a career and make money, because I really didn't see any until I like made like Maya Rudolph. That was the first, and I guess kind of Deborah Wilson on Mad TV, but it seemed like, I'm not going to be able to do this and have a career like a Mitch Hedberg or something. But in middle school, like at our talent shows, I would just like recreate stand-up bits. I would dress up as like Mitch Hedberg and just do Mitch Hedberg's set, like perfect, like an imitation. I would play like Flight of the Conchord songs. I used to like print out scripts of Weekend Update and make my friends like perform it with me. So I always knew that I loved comedy and writing and, writing creatively. But I think by the time I got to high school, I was kind of like, oh, you can't do that. Like, that's not a serious thing to do to make money. And, my mom wanted me to go to law school. And I was like, I have to, if I'm going to write, it has to be serious news.
I feel like I end up talking to a lot of comedians who had some sort of interest in law or some pressure to law before they started doing comedy.
Yeah,
it feels so
I think it's
now.
Our parents saying we're annoying or something.
So go be annoying for a greater good,
for
potentially.
A greater good, yeah. Because like when I went to college, I first semester like had originally signed up for pre-law as my major, and then I very quickly was like, no, thank you, please, I'm gonna do English. And it wasn't until really my junior year of college that I started to go like, I don't think I want to do this. I want to write, but not in a serious way. I want to write about, I want to just like make queer art. I want to like create things and talk about things that are gay and talk about art and get people to talk about it. And that's really where I found criticism and just, started to develop my focus on pop culture. And really, I guess at that point, I had started to really narrow in on like Black television and the golden age of Black TV. And then I really started to just kind of personally study and write about the successes and failures of gay representation in Black TV shows.
Well, it feels like an interesting through line from that genre and your career path is that when you first started talking about queer, you were saying that you loved secrets. You love things that seemed like you shouldn't be looking at. And it feels like perhaps that was your beginning of starting to categorize things. Perhaps you felt the injustice of the fact that you had to hide the fact that you were watching the L Word from your mom. Does that ring true to you? Like this sort
Yeah.
of like, did you have this impulse that from a young age?
Yeah, I think from a young age, I had this impulse of like, this isn't what I'm supposed to be doing. This is stuff I have to hide. Like, this isn't appropriate. It's not responsible. It's not respectable.
And talking about comedy and the Mitch Hedberg of it all, we're two, monotone Black people.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I think I also didn't really, I didn't see a path for myself after two things. The first, Black president has a pretty monotone voice. That was okay. The world is ready for a Black guy.
They're ready for us. After all the damage Steve Urkel did. Finally.
So I hope you enjoyed this best of trip down memory lane, focused around the theme of TV. There'll be a few more episodes like this coming up, and then we'll be back to the normal rotation of You Are the Genre. So this is Tim Barnes signing off with your weekly reminder that you are the genre. Thanks for listening and supporting the show.
First I got your voicemail, then I got you. We can meet in person or maybe on Zoom. So tell me what your genre, tell me what do you do? I'd like to know the things that specifically make